Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are exploring the subject Life After Death, based on a book by Annie Besant. And this is our second class. We saw in our previous class a general view about death. And today we are going to examine the first process in this that we call death, that is when the soul lets go of the physical body and its ethereal counterpart. So let us begin with the fate of the body. And Annie Besant gives us a quote from Blavatsky that says, "Chemical science says that there is no difference between the matter which composes the ox and that which forms man. But the occult doctrine is far more explicit. It says not only the chemical compounds are the same, but the same infinitesimal invisible lives compose the atoms of the bodies of the mountain and the daisy, of man and the ant. Each particle is alive." So before the development of science, there was a natural thought in most people that human beings were completely different from everything else around in nature, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition or the cultures that develop primarily within these religions, because of the idea of the primacy of a human being when the human being was created. So there was this intuitive idea that we were very different. When science begins to look into our constitution, it discovers that we actually are made of exactly the same substance that everything around is made of. And for some people, this was something difficult to accept because that seemed to bring human beings down to the same level of everything else in creation. Of course, the idea of evolution, the idea that we were not created as a special creation, but we developed out of the animal kingdom, was also very controversial and unsettling for people who were basing their worldview on the religious teachings. All of this helped, to those who could accept it, helped to generate a sense of the connection between human beings and everything around. But the problem is that the view that science was bringing was a purely materialistic view. So even though human beings began to realize that we are not different from everything that is around, essentially, that didn't produce any sense of unity because it was just focused on the material aspect. There is an article where Blavatsky says that. She says that even if science can demonstrate that at the very essence of physical matter, we are one with everything, that was not likely going to produce any mystical sense of unity because that comes from a recognition on a spiritual level of that unity. So she tried to introduce the idea that matter is not just matter. Matter is also a form of life and energy, something that later on Einstein would discover and frame in his famous equation. And Theosophy goes even further and says, just like matter and energy or life are two aspects of the same, consciousness is also an aspect of the same. So whenever you have matter, you have a form of energy, you have a form of consciousness. Very different from the consciousness of human beings if we are talking about minerals or plants or animals or celestial beings, but these are all different forms of consciousness. So here Besant is going to focus on what happens at death, at the moment of death with the body, but more from the point of view of these lives that Blavatsky mentions here, these infinitesimal, invisible lives. So we'll see a little more about that. Besant says these lives, which separate and independent, are the minute vehicles of automatic vitality, aggregated together, form the molecules and cells of the physical body, and they stream in and out during all the years of bodily life, thus forming a continual bridge between man and his environment. So remember in our previous class, we saw that there are two aspects to what we call the life principle, the principle that gives the energy to be alive. One of them, the more basic one, was this automatic vitality, which Annie Besant says this automatic vitality, this intrinsic life that is in our body, in every particle of our body, it's the vehicle for that kind of life are these very minute, invisible lives that Blavatsky was talking about. So, we have the idea of prana. Prana, when clairvoyants describe prana, these are particles. It's kind of a quantum view of energy where this energy is mediated by pranic particles of different kinds. And that prana, when it manifests physically, because prana is not physical, it does it through these invisible lives, which are the essence, constitute the essence of the atoms and molecules, etc. So in the Theosophical view, the motion that atoms and the molecules, and then the cytoplasm of a cell, and then the cell as a whole, all this motion is a form of consciousness, is a form of energy, and it's all mediated by this automatic vitality. So we are made up of living organisms. Each cell is a living organism, but also each molecule and atom on their own levels are living organisms that have their own kind of vitality, this automatic vitality that Annie Besant talks about here. And these particles are all coming in and out of the human frame, as she says, making a continual bridge between the environment and ourselves, so that the atoms that are in our heart right now may have been part of an elephant not too long ago. The atoms that are in our brain may have been part of a worm or of a mushroom or whatever else. So there is really, we are made up physically of the environment. We are made up physically of the earth. And there is an intrinsic connection on the physical level with our environment. And the same happens on the inner levels. And we will see part of that. Now, besides the life that is intrinsic in matter, in any given organism, those lives begin to work together. Those lives aggregate to form molecules, and then aggregate to form cellular structures, and then they aggregate to form a cell, and then a tissue, an organ, and a body. So how does this happen? How is this process of aggregation and coordination, how does this take place? It is by means of this other kind of vitality that Besant calls energizing vitality. So she says, controlling these are the fiery lives. She's using a term that Blavatsky uses in The Secret Doctrine. The energizing vitality, which constrain these to their work of building up the cells of the body, so that they work harmoniously and in order, subordinated to the higher manifestation of life, in which the complex organism, uh, in the complex organism called man. So we have two levels of life: the individual life of the particles, and that individual life begins to get more and more complex, more and more organized, so that we get to a higher level of life, that is the life of the organism as a whole. So even though our organism has been alive from yesterday to today, many of its particles on this lower level of lives have died or departed, or the death, of course, is the death of the form, or only these minute lives that are within any particular form, a molecule or a cell. Once that form dies, they go back to the ocean of life around, and then they infuse new molecules or cells, etc. So there are these two levels here of life: the living matter and this higher organizing kind of life that brings living matter together to make up a living organism. So here we have that this is just a summary: the automatic vitality that is on the physical level, the lives that make up the atoms, and then the energizing vitality on the etheric level, that are the fiery lives that coordinate them. So she continues: when the fiery lives no longer exercise this function of coordination in the human body, the lower lives run rampant and begin to break down the hitherto definitely organized body. At death, they become a tumultuous mob, rushing hither and thither with no common object, no generally recognized authority. The body is never more alive than when it is dead, but it is alive in its units, while dead in its totality as an organism. So this is where science finds a difficulty to understand life. The life of the physical particles, science explains it as the energy that is intrinsic in every atom, and then there are molecules in particular that the body can break, and from breaking those molecules, you get some level of energy that the cells can use. So science can more or less explain what energy, let's say, means, or what life means at the level of these basic constituents of a human body. But science cannot explain this other larger or higher kind of life that is what we call, life. When, for example, if you stop the heart of an organism and the organism dies, all the cells, a second after the organism dies, all those cells are perfectly fine. There is no illness, there is no malfunction in the cells. So if you bring back the heart, to work, and you are not able to revive that organism, why is the organism dead if it is exactly the same as before? There is something, there is a principle that in a dead organism is not there any longer, even though all the cells may be in a perfectly, good shape, let's say. So this higher principle that whenever it is in an organism, we say the organism is living, and whenever it is not, we say the organism is dead. Science doesn't know what it is. So if you see scientific definitions of life, they say there is not really a definition of life. Rather, we define what a living organism is. So it is an organism that has a metabolism, that has the ability to reproduce itself, etc., etc. But there is no scientific definition of what life in itself is. So the idea here is that life, what we are calling life, is this energizing vitality, which was keeping all the individual molecules and cells working together. It is like a higher ordering law that is keeping everything together. And when that law is gone, when that higher kind of vitality is gone, then the coordination is over. And then everything is still alive in the body. Every single cell is still as alive as before, but now they start working independently, and therefore the organism begins to dissolve because the structures are not kept together any longer. Also because the means that the organism has to feed all the individual cells is gone when this higher life is gone. So eventually the cells begin to die also, the individual cells. Now, this higher kind of life, this energizing life, needs a vehicle, a physical vehicle of expression to keep all these lower individual lives together. And that vehicle is what we call the etheric double. So the etheric double is a vehicle of prana, Annie Besant says, the life principle or vitality. Through the etheric double, prana exercises the controlling and coordinating force spoken of above, and death takes triumphant possession of the body when the etheric double is finally withdrawn and the delicate cord which unites it with the body is snapped. So how does this happen, that this energizing vitality leaves the body? The reason is because the vehicle of expression that this vitality uses, that is this etheric body. Remember, I showed you last class a figure where you would see this thin aura around the body. That's the etheric double. So when that etheric double is separated from the physical body, and there is a cord that connects the two, which is in many traditions, the silver cord is sometimes called. When that cord is snapped, and there is a complete separation between the two, then the energizing vitality cannot get to the body any longer, because this is a body without an etheric double. And that is when death happens. As long as there is that silver cord exists, as long as there is a connection between the etheric body and the physical body, it is possible to bring back a person or another organism to life. Not always possible, but it is possible to bring it back because the connection is still there. Once that connection is severed, then there is no possibility of bringing that body back into life. So the way that we would define death or physical death from a theosophical point of view is when that silver cord is severed, and then this energizing vitality has no vehicle to work on the body. Now, the process of withdrawal, Annie Besant says, of this etheric double from the body has been watched by clairvoyants and definitely described. A seer describes how he himself watched this escape of the ethereal body, and he states that the magnetic cord did not break for some 36 hours after apparent death. Others have described in similar terms how they saw a faint violet mist rise from the dying body, gradually condensing into a figure which was the counterpart of the expiring person, and attached to that person by a glistening thread. The idea is that that silver cord can be severed. The time that it takes for that to be severed varies. In general, it doesn't go beyond, as Annie Besant says here, 36 hours. When people can be brought back, you need two conditions. You need the silver thread to be still functioning, and also you need the body to be in a state, the cells of the body to be in a state that can sustain life. After some minutes, the cells, because there is no flow of blood and the cells don't have any nutrition, after a few minutes, the cells begin to die. So even if the silver cord is still intact, consciousness cannot come back to the body any longer. So you need the two situations. And this is what we see with people who have near-death experiences, where when they were dead for a few minutes, but obviously the etheric double was still connected to the physical body. It depends how long it takes. It depends on the kind of death of the person. If it is a sudden death, the silver cord is still quite strong, let's say. If it is a death that is more by just natural death, then one can think that there is a gradual weakening of that silver cord. So there is a smoother transition in a sense. But in any case, what Annie Besant says here is that a clairvoyant can see the etheric double leaving the body as this kind of violet mist, and then beginning to shape itself with the same image of the physical body above or around the dying body. And then with the cord uniting it to the physical body, but that cord begins to weaken until eventually it breaks. So the etheric double always has the same kind of, it's a mirror image of the physical body. Actually, when the physical body begins to be formed in the womb, it is said that what guides the form of the physical body is this ethereal counterpart. It is the ethereal body which begins to develop, and then the physical cells follow the pattern, the model that the ethereal body takes. So our ethereal aspect, it's exactly an image of the physical body. So Annie Besant says the snapping of the thread means the breaking of the last magnetic link between the dense body and the remaining principles of the human constitution. The body has dropped away from the person. You see how this is phrased. The real person is not the body, it's the soul. So at death, the body drops from who we are. So it's not that in some way, the body loses the soul. It's the opposite. It's the soul loses the body. So this is signaling that reversal of how we interpret who we are that we discussed in our previous class. So the body has dropped away from the person. He is excarnated, disembodied. And now 6 principles still remain as his constitution immediately after death. The 7th, or the dense body, being left as a cast-off garment. So remember, in the Theosophical tradition, we talk about 7 principles. Now we are entities with 6 principles because we just dropped the physical body. As we are going to see, the etheric body dissolves soon after the physical body, and then we are entities with 5 principles. So the way that Annie Besant presents this and the Theosophical teachings in general is as casting off these garments, as if we had several layers of clothing, and then one by one, we let go of those layers, as we are going to see. So she says, death consists indeed in a repeated process of unrobing or unsheathing. The immortal part of man shakes off from itself, one after the other, its outer casings. And as the snake from its skin, or the butterfly from its chrysalis, emerges from one after another, passing into a higher state of consciousness. So again, the idea is that while we are, as we call, alive, we are in the situation where there is the most matter blinding our innate wisdom, our spiritual qualities. All the virtues that are described in religions are actually descriptions of what we are, our true nature. Every soul has these qualities. Depending on the degree of evolution, some of those qualities are more or less dormant, but they are all qualities that are intrinsic in the soul. Just like in a healthy mind, the ability to understand is intrinsic, even though a baby at the moment has not unfolded that ability of understanding is intrinsic in the mind. So similarly, all our virtues are intrinsic in the human soul. And throughout evolution, the human soul develops these virtues. But when the soul takes on all these principles to be able to express in the dense, lower realm of the physical, then all this encasing limits the understanding of the soul, limits the expression of the soul, etc. It's not that the physical plane is something evil or a mistake or anything like that. Many philosophies denounce the physical, as being something evil because of this effect that the physical has on the soul. In the Theosophical view, it is true that the physical is like a veil on the soul, but it is a veil that is necessary for the soul to unfold all its potentialities. So it is something that is necessary. And once the soul unfolds all its potentialities, the physical becomes less and less of a veil. The physical always has certain limitations. When we are working on higher principles, there are no limitations of space. But on the physical plane, there are limitations of space, for example. And like that, there are many limitations that are intrinsic to the physical. But in an enlightened being, the physical is no longer a veil for the knowledge of the soul of its own nature, although it's still a veil in many other ways, as I just mentioned, for example, or a veil or a limitation, as I mentioned, the physical limitation, for example. So Besant continues, now it is a fact that the escape from the body can be effected during earth life, so that man may become familiar with the excarnated condition, and it may lose for him all the terrors that encircle the unknown. So what she's saying here is that a similar process that happens during death can actually be reproduced during our daily life. Our consciousness can leave the body, not permanently, as it happens after death, but can leave the body and be in the same realm that the consciousness of the body that died is during our daily life. So by this means, consciousness can recognize, learn about that realm that our consciousness visits, and we are going to see a little of this, but actually every time we go to sleep, we leave the body behind, we leave the etheric double behind, and we are on a plane that is the same plane on which people who die are first aware, on this astral plane, as it is called in Theosophical teachings. The difference is that in the case of a person that is asleep, the etheric double is still connected to the physical body. So when the consciousness comes back to the etheric double, then the etheric double, let's say, wakes up the body, or through the etheric double, consciousness can again move the physical body. In the case of a dead person, we saw that there is this severance of the connection. But this is a very important point, because for a person that begins to study about all of this, that meditates, so that it begins to experience some states of consciousness that are less tied to the physical body, and with all the spiritual practice, a person begins to be more aware on the astral plane while the physical body is asleep. That person begins to be so familiar with the astral plane that at death, it's coming to a familiar condition or environment. There are different degrees of realization of what this astral plane is while we are alive. Eventually, as Annie Besant will say, a person may learn to be completely aware on the astral plane while the physical body is awake. But there are degrees to get there. Some people go to sleep and they themselves, when the body is asleep, their consciousness is also asleep on the astral plane. But people who begin to be more interested in spirituality and develop their mind and emotions, they begin to be aware on the astral plane. So that is the next step. And then with more training, people can be aware of the astral plane, even when the physical body is not asleep. This would be like clairvoyance, for example. So there is a whole development, but even the fact of being aware on the astral plane when the physical body is asleep, it begins to give consciousness the knowledge of what that plane is, so that when the physical body dies, consciousness finds itself on the same plane, and on that plane, consciousness remembers every experience that it had on that plane every time that the physical body was asleep. So the experience after death for a person that is already aware on the astral plane is very smooth and is non-traumatic. But for people who may not, and who may have had incorrect, beliefs and fear of hell, or they thought there was nothing after death, when they find themselves on the astral plane, they just don't understand what is going on. We will see that later. But so Annie Besant says there is the possibility to become familiar with this excarnated condition. And she continues, having found that this process results not in unconsciousness, but in a vastly extended freedom and vividness of life, why should he fear the final casting away of his fetters and the freeing of his immortal self from the prison of the flesh? So here again, we see that Annie Besant says the experience on the inner planes is not less than the physical experience, as many people imagine. On the contrary, it's a vastly extended freedom and vividness of life. So we all experience that when the body is asleep and we are on the astral plane. If we are aware there, even though we may not remember this when we come back to the body, we may be fully aware on the astral plane, then come back to the body and the memory is lost, because bringing the memory of those experiences require a different mechanism that we cannot go into right now, but it requires the development of certain connections. But anybody that is aware on the astral plane enjoys a vastly extended freedom. We are not limited any longer by space, by being tired or not, by the state of health of the body, or by the amount of energy that the body may have, etc., etc. There are many limitations that are left behind every time we leave the body asleep. And the life there is far more vivid. We are far closer to our true nature. We have a far wider view of life, of ourselves. We are, again, closer to realizing who we are, understanding who we are, etc. So actually, the transition to the astral plane, it's experienced as being freed from the prison of the flesh, but especially by people who have during life encouraged this kind of, let's call it, spiritual life, spiritual interests, spiritual aspirations. We will talk more about all of this as the series proceeds. So Besant talks about this gradual development that I mentioned. She says, the aspirant first learns to identify himself with the immortal triad, with our spiritual nature, and rises above the body and its passions into a pure mental and moral life. So if our lives are based on physical experiences, physical activities, we don't have higher interests, whether intellectual, artistic, or emotional at the level of trying to help others, or being focused on the collective good in one way or the other, on developing virtues, on trying to live a good life from a spiritual point of view. If none of these things interest us, and all that we enjoy are things connected to the body, merely to the body, food or sex or physical activities, and that's the whole of our life. When that person dies and finds himself or herself without a physical body, the experience is not pleasant for the person, because that person is in a state, is living in a world that he or she had never an interest about and has no ability to appreciate. But for people who begin to, as Annie Besant says here, identify with the spiritual nature, and begin to be attracted to, let's call it generally, spirituality, then death is breaking free from a prison. Death is the reward for all this aspiration. Death is when we can fulfill all these aspirations that are difficult to fulfill in the current world, in the physical world. Death is really or the life after death is really a blissful experience, as we are going to see. So the first step is to begin to produce this transformation in us, to begin to be more attracted to those things that are not merely physical. That doesn't mean that the physical should not be part of our experience. It's perfectly fine. The question is, do you live for this, or this is just part of the experience of being alive, but this is not the reason or what you are constantly searching, looking for, and looking forward, things related to the physical body. So that's the first step. Then she says, he learns that the conquered body cannot hold him prisoner, and he unlocks its door and steps out into the sunshine of his true life. So this is what I was explaining at the beginning. When the body is asleep, eventually there, by means of meditation, etc., there may be the experience of being aware on the astral plane consciously while the body is still awake. And then, so she says, when death unlocks the door for him, he knows the country into which he emerges, having trodden its ways at his own will. So we talked about that. And at last, she says, he grows to recognize that fact of supreme importance, that life has nothing to do with body and with this material plane, that life is his conscious existence, unbroken, unbreakable, and that the brief interludes in that life during which he sojourns on earth are but a minute fraction of his conscious existence. So little by little, through the evolution of the soul begins to realize and to retain that kind of realization more and more, that we are eternal, the sense of being eternal, the sense that we can never die, because when the body dies, we are still there. And when the next body dies, on the inner planes, we will see, as Annie Besant said, is a progressive letting go of bodies, each subtler than the previous one. And that as each body is left behind, we are still there and we are aware. And we are not only aware, we are more aware, we are wiser about who we are less deluded. So with repeated experiences, the soul little by little learns to retain that sense, the strong sense of its eternity. So that even when the soul incarnates in any given life, there is this intuition that we are far more than the body. This is the difference between a materialistic person and a person that follows spirituality in a mature way. Because many people follow religion or spirituality, even motivated by their attachment to the body. They cling to the idea of reincarnation because they are attached to the physical body. So I wouldn't say that that is necessarily more mature than a person that doesn't believe in anything after death. But the point is that, generally speaking, that soul retains the sense of eternity, and that's why this person is attracted to some form of spirituality. Again, we can't say that this is always the case. There may be many reasons why a person is materialistic in a particular lifetime for karmic reasons, and that person may be very mature, but for karmic reasons, the brain just is not sensitive to that spiritual aspect, for example. So never take any of these things in absolute ways, but generally speaking, that sense of eternity is brought back into the body, first as an intuition, and as evolution proceeds, that intuition becomes a very clear knowledge, and eventually all that becomes evident to the physical consciousness, the spiritual truths, because there is the possibility of experiencing them even while within the body. So physical life is a short interlude, as Annie Besant says, and she says that during these short interludes, we are less alive because of the heavy coverings which weigh us down. Only then may we wholly lose our consciousness of continued life. At death, we step out of the prison again into the sunlight and are nearer to reality. So we already talked about that. Short are the twilight periods, what we call life. These are very short, intermediate, in a sense, twilight, periods. and long the periods of the sunlight. But in our blinded state, we call the twilight life, and to us it is the real existence, while we call the sunlight death and shiver at the thought of passing into it. So you see, this is part of what we discussed in our previous class, how this view is the opposite to what we normally perceive. When we are blinded by matter, when we forget our continued existence, which Annie Besant says, it's only here, it's only when within the body that we forget our eternity. Once we step out of the physical body, that sense of eternity is perceivable on all the inner planes. But when we come and work within a physical body, then is when we lose the sense of eternity, and we assume that we are mortals, that we will die with the body. So these short experiences of the soul within a body are really the death of the soul from a certain point of view. And leaving the body behind is the rebirth of the soul. Again, all this allegorically, we are not saying that the physical plane is evil or matter is evil, etc. But relatively speaking, the physical plane is the more limiting on the soul. And the idea of short is because in the Theosophical view, we spend a far longer time between incarnations than what we spend embodied, experiencing life in a physical body. Just to put some numbers, and we will see that, in the next series. But let's say we live for 100 years in a body. Outside of the body, a person that was interested in spirituality, maybe 1,200 years, 2,000 years, even more. But normally the average is said to be about 1,200 years outside of the body. Now, you see, modern spirituality, maybe we could call it the New Age spirituality, which, as most spiritual manifestations that become more massive, is normally heavily influenced by the materialistic, frame of mind of the age in which it develops. Let me do a parenthesis. Like in the past, religious doctrines were interpreted in very materialistic ways. The idea that heaven is a place paved with gold and with jewels and all that. That's a very materialistic understanding of heaven. Similarly, a lot of the modern spirituality at the bottom is still very conditioned by the materialistic understanding that we have of life. So many times there is this idea that we reincarnate very fast, and that the good thing is to reincarnate, and the emphasis is placed on, what were our experiences in different incarnations, and looking forward for the next incarnation. Well, this is all the reverse of what the Theosophical teachings propose. As Annie Besant is saying, the moments where we are incarnated are actually the moments when the soul has to come and work and suffer, and of course have joy also. But Theosophical teachings say even the most joyous happiness that we can experience on the physical body during physical life cannot compare with the experience of spiritual bliss that is possible on the higher planes. Again, this is not to say to give a pessimistic view of life. On the contrary, we are saying there is a far deeper bliss that is possible for human beings than anything that we can experience during our incarnated condition. And the idea in the Theosophical teachings is that the more spiritual a person is, the more time the person spends on the inner planes between incarnations, because that's our real life. We come here, it's like coming to the physical life is like the process of eating. During the day we eat, let's say at lunch and at dinner, let's say, and that's a very short experience when compared to everything we do during the day. And we eat because we need it to keep the body going and to have all the other experiences. So similarly, coming to the physical plane, in a certain sense, is like eating for the soul, gathering experiences that the soul needs to assimilate. And we will see this in the next series because it's part of a higher, later process in the process after death. But the experience of the soul is far more than the eating, than the physical life. So the more spiritual a person is, like the more things that soul has to digest from the experience during the last life. So a short incarnation, we are brought back to incarnation mainly by desire, by attachment. So a short reincarnation implies an attachment to the physical. Of course, again, there are exceptions. When a life is cut short, there can be a very, an incarnation that is quite soon after the previous death. There can be people more advanced in the spiritual life that give up the enjoyment of our true life, on the inner planes, and incarnate far sooner in order to help humanity, etc. But the general idea is that reincarnation is more spread apart the more spiritual you are. And that's why the physical life is a very short period in comparison. So as we realize all of this and we have this experience of being alive beyond the body, as when the body's asleep, death loses for us all its terrors, and at its touch, the body slips from us as a garment, and we stand out from it, erect and free. The evolving God within releases himself, and so much of the personality goes with him as has raised itself into union with the divine. So the soul will bring, and we will see that later, will bring from the last personality anything that is spiritual, that was spiritual, because that is the experience that the soul can assimilate. All the rest the soul doesn't care about. Things that belong to the body are useless for the soul that it doesn't really have a body. So we will see all of that. But the more spirituality that personality experienced, then the more material the soul has to assimilate. So then what happens, we saw what happened with the physical body, that the automatic vitality goes rampant and the body dissolves. Let's see what happens with the etheric double. Besant says the etheric double is the ethereal counterpart of the gross body of man. Besant for the physical body uses the words gross or dense to distinguish it from the ethereal part. Acting as the reservoir or vehicle of the life principle during earth life, its withdrawal from the body is naturally marked by the lowering of all vital functions, even while the cord which unites the two is still unbroken. So when we go to sleep, falling asleep is simply the withdrawal of the etheric body from the physical body. So the etheric body is like floating next to the physical body, still connected by the cord when we are asleep. But the body falls asleep because the etheric body is not fully there any longer. And this is what she says, that when the ethereal body leaves the body, there is a lowering of the vital functions. How deep is that departure will determine how low the vitality is in the body. And then she says, the snapping of the cord means the death of the body, as we saw. And here it may be well to say that during the slow process of dying, while the etheric double is withdrawing from the body, taking with it the higher principles, remember the body is dropped and the etheric double now becomes the vehicle for all the higher principles, for all the other 5 principles, the ethereal body being the 6th one. So when it withdraws, taking with it all the higher principles, and after it has withdrawn, extreme quiet and self-control should be observed in the chamber of death. For during this time, the whole life passes swiftly in review before the ego, which is a technical term for the soul. So this is what we know about many near-death experiences. People experience this review of the past life, the life that is just ending. Because they were recalled into the body, they many times can retain a memory of this process. When the review is over, then the silver cord breaks, and then death really comes. And the review is still is near death, is still part of the living aspect. The person is still alive, is in the process of dying, because after death, the consciousness cannot come back into the body any longer after the break of the cord. So she says that during this time, extreme quiet and self-control should be observed. And she quotes one of Blavatsky's teachers saying, "At the last moment, the whole life is reflected in our memory and emerges from all the forgotten nooks and corners, picture after picture, one event after another. The man may appear dead, yet from the last pulsation till the moment when the last spark of animal heat or biological heat leaves the body, the brain thinks, and the ego lives over in those few brief seconds his whole life. Speak in whispers, ye who find yourselves in the solemn presence of death, lest it disturb the quiet ripple of thought and hinder the busy work of the past, casting its reflection upon the veil of the future." In the Theosophical view, the moment of death is a very sacred and important time, because, as Annie Besant will mention, there is a review of the previous lifetime, there is a selection of the main features of that lifetime, and that selection will influence the experience after death, and also will influence the next personality, the qualities of the next personality in a future incarnation. So because this is happening on the inner planes, let's say, whenever there are strong emotions around the person that is dying, the process can be disturbed. There is like emotional noise there that can interfere in this review. So Besant says, this is the time during which the dominant tendencies, the strongest thought habits, assert their preeminence and stamp themselves as the characteristics which will appear as innate qualities in the succeeding incarnation. This balancing up of the life issues, this reading of the karmic records, is too solemn and momentous a thing to be disturbed by the ill-timed wailings of personal relatives and friends. Because all memory in the Theosophical view is simply, memories are not stored in the brain. The brain is like the receptacle that connects consciousness to the Akashic records of things that we have done during our life. So remembering something is simply recalling the Akashic record of something that we did. So at the end of life, everything can be remembered, even very minute things, because they are not really being remembered in the sense of something that is happening within the brain. At that time, the soul looks at the whole record, Akashic record of that lifetime. But because there is a blending, as we are going to see, Blavatsky explains, at that moment there is a blending of the soul consciousness with the personal consciousness. So all this review happens in a more impersonal way. There is an understanding of why things were the way they were, what was the purpose of that, etc., etc. And all this is very important, as I said, for what is to come. So the idea is that people around should be quiet, not only physically, but also emotionally. Of course, there may be a certain sense of loss, but there has to be some self-control to help the process that is going on there. You may notice that many times relatives die when nobody's around or where few people are around. It's very common that a relative that is next to the dying person goes to the bathroom, and that's when the person dies or something like that. And I think this is, within, if karma allows it, this is the soul trying to find a moment to do this transition when there are not many disturbances around. So Blavatsky wrote, at the solemn moment of death, every man, and remember this was written at the end of the 19th century, so there was not the gender neutral language, so this means everybody. So every man, even when death is sudden, sees the whole of his past life marshaled before him in its minutest details. For one short instant, the personal become one with the individual. That's what I was saying, the individual and all-knowing ego, the soul. But this instant is enough to show to him the whole chain of causes which have been at work during his life. He sees and now understands himself as he is, unadorned by flattery or self-deception. He reads his life, remaining as a spectator, looking down into the arena he is quitting. In the near-death experiences, it depends when the consciousness is recalled. In some cases, the review may be close to the end. In some other cases, it may only be halfway. In some cases, it may only be the beginning, the preparation of consciousness to look at things in this way. Sometimes it's not even quite a near-death experience. It may be that the body is agonizing and the person's consciousness is on the astral plane, just as when we go to sleep. And on the astral plane, similar things may happen, but these are not true near-death experiences. It's simply that an astral experience, while the body is still alive, or although very weak or agonizing. So this is a complex subject, but generally speaking, we can take these general stages. There is near to death, there is this review, then there is the snapping of the cord, and there is the passing on to the astral plane that we will see next week. This vivid sight is succeeded in the ordinary person by the dreamy, peaceful semi-consciousness spoken of above, as the etheric double floats above the body to which it has belonged, now completely separated from it. So the idea is that when the review is over, when the cord is in the process of breaking, most people just fall asleep, fall into a state of unconsciousness or semi-consciousness, like a dreamy state of mind. And then they wake up either on the astral plane or on higher planes. We will see all that. And then the last concept here, Besant says, sometimes this double is seen by people in the house or in the neighborhood when the thought of the dying has been strongly turned to someone left behind, or when some anxiety has been in the mind at the last moment, something left undone, or when some local disturbance has shaken the tranquility of the passing entity. There is a possibility in this moment of a projection of the etheric double. This happened when I was in high school. The father of one of my best friends died. And at the moment he was dying in the hospital, neighbors saw him sitting outside the house in a chair, as he used to do every week or every day. And so they thought that he was better because they saw him there. And then when they heard that he had passed, they couldn't believe it. So this happens sometimes that either because of attachment, because of anxiety, as Annie Besant says, there may be a projection of the etheric double to the familiar place, to the familiar person, etc. Normally, it's a very unconscious projection. It's not that the person is there. It's more like a reflective, projection that has no real intelligence. Annie Besant says, under these conditions or others of a similar nature, the double may be seen or heard. When seen, it shows the dreamy, hazy consciousness alluded to. It's silent, vague in its aspect, unresponsive. As the days go on, the five higher principles gradually disengage themselves from the etheric double and shake this off as they previously shook off the grosser body. So then the higher consciousness now leaves the etheric body behind. So this higher consciousness, these five principles pass on into a state to be next studied, leaving the etheric double with the dense body, of which it is a counterpart, thus becoming an ethereal corpse as much as the body has become a dense corpse. So now the etheric double is also a corpse. And this ethereal corpse remains near the dense body, and they disintegrate together. Clairvoyants see these ethereal rays in the churchyards, sometimes showing likeness to the dead dense body, sometimes as violet mists or lights. The process goes on pari passu, like step by step or hand in hand, until all but the actual bony skeleton of the dense body is completely disintegrated, and the particles have gone to form other combinations. So because the etheric double was always connected to the physical, many times the etheric double reproduces, if a clairvoyant sees it, will see it looking just like the physical body in its process of disintegration. In many movies you see like ghosts that may have the wound that the dead physical body has, or that are, have disintegrated. And that has a basis of truth, except that the etheric double is just a corpse. It doesn't have any consciousness or energy. Although there are what Blavatsky and Besant used to call black magic. There are rituals or things that can be done to instill some kind of consciousness in a dead ethereal body, and that becomes not a nice entity, of course. But normally, the etheric double disintegrates along with the physical body. Now, to prevent all of this, cremation is a good, practice. Annie Besant says one of the great advantages of cremation, apart from all sanitary conditions, lies in the swift restoration to Mother Nature of the physical elements composing the dense and ethereal corpses, brought about by the burning. Instead of the slow and gradual decomposition, swift dissociation takes place, and no physical remnants are left working possible mischief, in the cases that I mentioned of black magic. Ethereal corpses, like dense ones, if not swiftly destroyed by burning, should be left in a silence and darkness that is the worst profanity to break. So by means of cremation, since we get rid of the physical, the fleshy matter, then the ethereal double also is dissolved. Also, in the case of bodies that are eaten by animals, the Parsis have these towers of silence where they leave the bodies for the vultures. Any form of disposing the body that gets rid of the flesh as soon as possible is healthier than what we normally do, bury them and letting the body little by little get rotten along with the ethereal body. That's not, according to the Theosophical teachings, the best process to follow. But when that happens, the best is to leave them and let the natural process to go on.